great deal of compassion, Jim Calvert has created one of the most remarkable World War II memoirs to date. James F. Calvert, Vice Admiral, USN, retired, was one of the Navy's most decorated officers in World War II. After the war, he became the second skipper to command a U.S. nuclear-powered submarine. In 1959, his ship, the Skate, broke through the ice to surface at the North Pole, the first ship of any kind to reach that part of the Earth on the surface. In 1964, he became the second youngest Rear Admiral in the Navy's history. Admiral Calvert served as Superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy and head of the Pacific Fleet. After his retirement from the Navy, he became assistant to the Chairman of the Board of Texaco. Admiral Calvert is the author of Surface at the Pole, The Naval Profession, and A Promise to Our Country. Silent Running, My Years on a World War II Attack Submarine, by James F. Calvert, Vice Admiral, USN, retired. Foreword by Edward L. Beach, Captain, USN, retired. Foreword. The scandalous misbehavior of U.S. submarine torpedoes, in fact, of all the torpedoes provided for our armed forces during the first 2 years of the war, has been described by many others. The well-justified dismay over this poor performance has obscured a salient fact related to the use of these underwater missiles in submarines. Where destroyers were expected to shoot all their fish in a single shotgun salvo, ideally against a distant enemy battle line, submarines worked to the other end of the spectrum. In submarine doctrine, shooting a torpedo was like firing a rifle. We took big risks to aim them individually and carefully, and we fired them at close range. Accurate aim was as important to torpedo performance as the proper working of its mechanisms, but no more. Poor aim could cause a miss, but so could a bad performance from our underwater missile. Both had to be simultaneously on the mark, or the fish and all the effort were wasted. Aiming a torpedo involved a combination of two talents: accurate periscope observation, which was the skipper's responsibility, and meticulously accurate operation of the torpedo data computer, the TDC, the complicated instrument used to aim the torpedoes. The early years of the war saw many failed torpedo shots, and a controversy erupted over what had caused them. The argument was finally sorted out late in 1943. The torpedoes had been carelessly designed and built, and insufficiently tested. We were aiming them well, but no amount of good aim could get a hit with a torpedo that did not run as touted. Since there was a multiplicity of faults, it took until nearly the end of that year before our submarines could go to sea with confidence that all, or nearly all, of the congenital malfunctions of their torpedoes had been corrected. By the fall of 1943, nearly 2 years after the war had begun, our accurately aimed fish were beginning to do the job that they should have been doing since the start of the war. It was early in 1944 that I first began to hear about Jim Calvert. Because of the overweening importance of good aim, a real TDC expert was truly worth his weight in gold coin. Jim was obviously such a person. I first learned his name in connection with one of the more amazing submarine attacks in the reports we regularly read of the exploits of other subs. The USS Jack, in which he served as TDC operator, had fired long-range, about 5,000 yards or more than 2 nautical miles, at a convoy of troop transports speeding away from it, and had sunk 3 of them. We submariners had been indoctrinated to believe that even 4,000 yards was far too long a torpedo run, that we could not be sure of adequate sharpshooter accuracy at that great distance. Yet, because the Jack had been unable to get closer to the flying targets, here was someone who had hit a target at maximum range and thereby converted failure, the targets got by, to success. 3 of them did not get by the Jack. As Calvert describes his experiences in the Jack, it becomes clear to all submariners acquainted with the wartime conditions of service that he must have been virtually 1 in a million. He was a TDC operator with that extraordinary ability, often bragged about but less frequently demonstrated, to make a TDC sing when it came to aiming the weapons. He describes how his skipper, a fairly senior officer renowned for his ability to make rapid and accurate observations with a periscope, following the submarine dictum that all on board should be able to perform all appropriate jobs, put him on the TDC for exercise. Jim called his first hits luck, and maybe there was some of that in the beginning. Nevertheless, he worked the problem with surpassing concentration and was able to put his exercise fish under the target the very first time he took over the instrument. While only a junior officer on board, just out of submarine school, he wound up with the TDC job in combat, and the Jack quickly became one of the legendary torpedo shooters in our Pacific submarine force. His skipper shared in that accolade, but to us more junior persons, Jim Calvert was the bedrock of the Jack's outstanding success. Here now we read Jim's version of how it happened, told modestly, as it has to be. Nevertheless, there is enough between the lines to make it clear that the author and his TDC had an affinity seldom seen. His awards for his wartime service reflect it, and his subsequent naval career has borne out the promise of those early years. There was, indeed, much more to Jim Calvert's career than just the war years or his naval service afterward. Most of this is left undescribed, or only hinted at, for this book is only about his service in World War II. For the record, however, the reader should know that he became one of the outstanding officers of our Navy, was superintendent of our Naval Academy in Annapolis, in which post he was promoted to Vice Admiral, and had come within an ace of being picked to be the Chief of Naval Operations, the senior naval officer in service, when he decided to terminate his naval career and go into private business. In this, too, he did extraordinarily well, but it is not a part of his wartime story, except insofar as his early performance presaged that of his later years. One has to remember that he was Jim at the time of which he writes. The Vice Admiral and corporate executive he grew into later. Some of his escapades are told with the impact of a confession, to himself if to no one else. Jim had a propensity for daring and risk-taking, something that later observers, knowing him only as a sober-sided vice admiral, might be surprised to discover. Risk was, of course, inherent in submarine warfare. We all took risks, sometimes big ones, in the course of wartime duties, but there were other sorts of risks, too. It is with a certain relish, therefore, that one reads how Vice Admiral Jim Calvert, then a lowly lieutenant, within a week after the war's end and before the formal surrender on board the USS Missouri, with a few other submariners went beyond the boundaries established for our preliminary occupation zone in Yokosuka, rode a train into Tokyo, and took an unauthorized tour of Japan's surrendered capital. The young men received some curious looks from the city's bemused inhabitants, but they got away with it as far as the Japanese were concerned. On their return to Yokosuka that afternoon, however, they found themselves in deep trouble for their violation of strict emergency occupation rules. No one was in deeper than Jim himself, for, owing to rapid promotion during the war, he found himself named as the senior officer of the malefactors, technically in charge of them, and therefore himself personally responsible for the military crime they had all committed. It was only the timely intervention by one of the submarine force's foremost leaders, who was able to see the escapade as the innocent end-of-the-war euphoria that it was, and happened fortunately to be on the spot, that saved the day. This gentleman, still revered by Jim, at the risk of his own career, tore up and threw away the official reporting papers that would have put Jim in the dock before a general court-martial. Jim Calvert's naval career was saved, and an esteemed future superintendent of our Naval Academy was preserved for the guidance of a later generation of young officers. We may today be glad that someone took a more liberal view of the incident than the individual who had written the charge. And now, Jim Calvert is seeing his later years. He has had a rich and full life. He fought for his country in the greatest war man has ever waged, and he served it loyally through the 50 years of troubled peace that followed the Armageddon of our era. Through it all, he remained faithful to the ideals with which he began his service. But now, as he relives some of those early days, he must wonder, as we all must, what has become of the exuberant youth he once was. In writing these reminiscences, he cannot but be struck that those years, at the very beginning of his eventful life, were the ones when he was able to make his greatest contribution to everything he has since held dear. Preface. This book is a record of the impressions and memories of my submarine experiences in World War II, covering 9 war patrols made in the Pacific against the Japanese. I have attempted to restrict myself to what I knew and experienced at that time, and how I felt about it then. I have done my best to ignore those layers of knowledge, cynicism, and worldliness that have inevitably come in the decades that have passed since these experiences. This book is about a small-town Ohio boy who, knowing very little of the world, was caught up in a titanic struggle between two nations being fought halfway around the world with complex and dangerous weapons. These are the memories of a young man who started out as the freshest and greenest of the officers in the USS Jack, one of the war's most successful submarines, and progressed upward to become the second in command of that ship by the end of the war. This book also deals with his experiences ashore in Australia between war patrols, a time that left an impression that lasted all his life. To many readers, steeped in the cynical and deprecating way in which so many veterans of World War II have spoken of their officers and of the branch of the armed forces in which they served, my enthusiasm for the submarine service and my senior officers may seem naive or uninformed. I can only repeat that I am attempting to reflect honestly what I felt at the time. I have included many conversations and pieces of dialogue. It should be clear to everyone that after nearly 50 years, the exact words, except in one or two memorable cases, are no longer available to me. But in each case, I have been careful to make the words reflect the gist of what was being said at the time. James F. Calvert, St. Michael's, Maryland, May 1995. Acknowledgments. The writing of memoirs, of whatever time of one's life, is an act of considerable egotism, and without the encouragement of my stepson, Kemp Battle, this book would never have been published. Kemp has written several books, knows the publishing business well, and had the persuasiveness to overcome my reluctance and inertia. He introduced me to a good literary agent and, in general, got me going. I am also indebted to Kemp's wife, Carolyn Slaughter, a well-known author, for many valuable suggestions and observations. I have made no pretense to original research other than that pertaining directly to my submarine, the USS Jack, and this book is in no sense a history of American submarines in World War II. That task has been admirably accomplished by Clay Blair, Jr. in Silent Victory, to which I am indebted for some of my background material, as well as for the confirmation of certain dates and statistics. I want also to acknowledge my dependence on Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison's 15-volume History of the United States Naval Operations in World War II for dates and a general perspective on the war in the Pacific, in which the Jack played only a very small part, but a highly important part to some of us. Special gratitude is due to Captain Edward L. Beach, a veteran of World War II submarining and a distinguished author. Ned is a good friend and has proved it by writing the foreword, but also by taking unusual care in going over the final manuscript and giving me some valuable corrections and suggestions. I also want to thank Rear Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Jr. for reading the manuscript, catching several errors of fact, and giving me some new and interesting material concerning the loss of the Harder. Chester was a very experienced and successful submarine officer in World War II, both as a junior officer and as a commanding officer. He knows whereof he speaks. In addition, I want to express my thanks to my Jack shipmate of World War II, Terence J. McCabe, for reading the manuscript, catching several errors of memory, and suggesting additional material. Terry's scrapbook also proved a valuable resource for photographs. Very special thanks are due to Mr. William R. Dick McCants, the son of a Naval Academy classmate of mine, Thomas R. McCants. Captain McCants was a distinguished World War II submariner, and his son has done his memory proud with a fine book, War Patrols of the USS Flasher. Tom McCants participated in all 6 of the patrols made by the Flasher, the ship that topped the list of American submarines in terms of total tonnage sunk. Dick McCants did all of the patrol track charts for silent running, and has given me other valuable assistance as well. However vivid my memories of these war patrols, I would not have been able to set them forth with any real accuracy without access to the original patrol reports of the Jack and the Haddo, made available to me by the Naval History Department of Washington, D.C. Both the Historical Center and the Naval Institute Press were helpful in supplying photographs. Thanks are also due to Haddo shipmate Jack Keller for the use of his diary of the trip to Tokyo. It was supplied to me by Al Vibrands, and it was very important to my telling of this tale. Some of the details had fallen from memory after all the intervening years. I want to express my gratitude to Rear Admiral Jim Finkelstein, the former Chief of Information of the Navy, for putting me in touch with several people who were helpful in the production of this book. An agent is a critical member of any author's team of allies, and I would like to thank Alexander Hoyt of New York City for his